The Gospel of Matthew is the Jewish story of a Jewish Messiah for an increasingly Gentile church. It's the first gospel of the New Testament that really links to the Jewish faith. So we got to ask the question, what kind of a people are we if our God is Israel's God and our Messiah and his apostles are Jewish? Join me as we talk more about the Jewish Gospel of Matthew. Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye, and welcome to this series, What Did Yeshua Mean? What did Jesus mean? And we're going to look at that from the perspective of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the book of Matthew is typically attributed to the tax collector Matthew, but really it's an anonymous book. We don't really know. We know that the book of Matthew is a Greek text, but it definitely has a Jewish flavor to it. And the book incorporates about 90% of the book of Mark, although the book of Mark is in more of an abridged form. So again, we go back to the siege of Jerusalem, around 70 Common Era. Afterwards, we find that the church itself has basically fled to the region of the Transjordan to the east, and others at that time have fled to Antioch. And what we have left in the land are Pharisees and Jewish Christians and a bunch of Jewish sects. And these are the ones that have survived the Roman subjugation. Matthew, again, is basically Greek-speaking Jewish Christians. And the world after the destruction of the temple, the world that's being described by Matthew, is a world emerging out of what we would call the rabbinic movement. So we have circles of Jewish sages and teachers of the law. And by the early 2nd century, Matthew becomes the church's favorite and most cited book of all of the New Testament, gospel books in particular. So our current Gospel of Matthew was not written in Hebrew, but Greek. And again, the book of Matthew makes quite a bit of use of Mark's Gospel and addresses quite frequently Jewish concepts of a Jewish Messiah and Jewish disciples in a Jewish environment. And so some even note that there's quite a similarity here between the early Syrian Christianity. Scholars have suggested that Matthew was actually writing for an audience, a larger audience in Antioch. There was a very large Jewish community there in Antioch that had not been devastated by the Jewish war in Israel when the Romans destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. Antioch was also an early Christian center as a mission for Gentiles. And so through the book we find that Matthew really is focused on Jewish believers, those in the 1st century who were Jews who had come to faith in Yeshua the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And that their role then was to bring the message of the kingdom, to launch the kingdom on earth to the Gentiles, to take it out past their small communities and congregations. Now, at the time, if you can imagine the conflict between these groups. So there was no love lost between Jewish believers and Gentiles, especially because of the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So you can imagine the kinds of chaos that would have created. And the message, which is a profound message for the time, I don't honestly think we can even appreciate how profound it is that God, through Yeshua the Messiah, had included the Gentiles. You have to remember that Israel has been subjugated and oppressed by Gentile rulers and Gentile empires for as far back as the eye can see. They have been crushed. They have had their freedom removed, always under the power of world empire, Gentile world empire. And so for them to be able to receive these Gentiles coming into the faith and joining them in their congregations was huge. And apparently we still have the same problem today. But again, that message of the gospel, that Jew and Gentile, Jew and non-Jew would come together and create and launch a new kingdom over the face of the earth, is profound, it's major, it's a subversive act on steroids, because the world simply did not function that way. And as we look back into the first century, we could say that this idea of Messianic Judaism at the time really was the proper heir of the older Jewish way. The idea of the Torah being fulfilled by Yeshua's love, and that Jewish Christians, Jewish believers, however you want to call them, were associating in increasing numbers with Gentile Christian believers. And so that's a recipe for disaster. I mean, it could be, and a recipe for chaos. So the question that Matthew is going to deal with, and really as we see all through the New Testament, is how do we maintain this unity? What do we have to do to keep the unity here between these two groups? And I would venture to say the problem today isn't really any different. How do we maintain the unity? People always have, when there is fractiousness and conflict, people kind of go into their corners, settle in with their little group of like-minded people, and it's we four and no more. They keep everyone out. So the idea of maintaining a unity between Jews and Christians back then isn't really much different than what we're dealing with today. Hopefully we have grown past that. But the idea of keeping the unity and the bond of peace in the community and the congregation has always been a challenge and has been always been difficult. So they find themselves after the destruction of the temple. Remember, I can't even begin to emphasize how significant and catastrophic this event was, because they have lost everything. They have lost their structure, their judicial structure, their commercial structure, their economic structure. They have lost their religious structure. And most importantly, they have lost their government structure, which was monarchy, the king. So now they got to figure out, how do we rebuild out of the ashes of losing absolutely everything? Remember, many of them have exited out of Israel to what we call the diaspora, to all the four corners of the Roman Empire. And so the books of the New Testament are designed to help explain the disaster and what to do about it. So you have left over after the destruction of the temple, you have the group of Pharisees, or what we might call the rabbinic leadership at the time. And we have Jewish Christians, or Jewish believers, and they're trying to figure out how this thing is going to work. And they are forced to reconfigure their beliefs and their communities, putting them back together without the temple as the center of their world. They think about it. I mean, 3 times a year, all of the men and families would go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. Like, this is a huge deal. And they would go up at, Passover, and up at Shavuot, the Feast of Pentecost, and then they would, of course, in the fall, for the fall festivals, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and basically going up for Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Like, their whole world is upended. And everything's been pulled out from under them. Their foundation is gone, and now they've got to figure out what to do with what's left. And so there was much conflict. Not only was there conflict between Jews and non-Jews, but now we have conflict between what we would call rabbinic Judaism, or the rabbinic leaders of the day, and the Jewish Christians. So that's a whole nother can of worms. And so Usually when there's conflict between groups, everybody looks for a scapegoat. And so the scapegoat in all of this would have been, quote, the new sect in town that was following Yeshua the Messiah. So it was a very confrontational period. And so they recognized, how on earth do we put this thing back together? How do we create unity in all the varying communities without a standing temple? This is just huge for the time. As I've talked quite a bit, and I cannot emphasize this enough as well, Yeshua, he wasn't just some little guy that wandered around healing people and raising the dead and, walking with the folks. And he was confronting the entrenched power structure of the day. And not just even the temple leadership was he pushing back, but he was pushing back against world empire, Rome, Caesar. Like, you didn't do that. And so we see some of his language in the stories that he tells and things that he does are kind of in code, because if he were just to come out and say it, certain things, he would end up in jail or worse, which obviously he did, because this is part of the problem here. He was crucified for pushing back against the entrenched power structure. He had, in essence, brought shame upon them, and he was raised up from the dead, which proved them all they were not the elite power of the world under God. But the leaders were part of that temple institution, and they ruled over everything. And as I mentioned, the institution of the temple really controlled all of their political life. It controlled their religious life and their cultural life. And I want you to understand, we have a tendency modern day to look at things through what we call a spiritual lens. And we have these two boxes. And in one box we have the real world, and then in the other box we have what we call the spiritual world. And we divide them, almost a form of dualism. We keep our lives in these two separate boxes. But this isn't the case in the first century. You could not separate out any of these things. The politics, the religion, and the culture of the day were one and the same. And they didn't sort of have life and then they sort of had this spiritual life where all this other kinds of stuff was going on. This was all one. And Yeshua recognized and knew intimately how power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely nothing new under the sun. And he saw how the temple had become corrupt. The leaders of the temple using graft and bribery and extortion and exercising power and control over the people. That's how it works. And so he is confronting that power. Now, when you confront that power, what happens to you? You get killed. Okay? Anyone who pushes back against the power base gets killed. That's how it's worked since time immemorial. And so ultimately, if you will, Yeshua has the last laugh, right? He is raised from, they think they have won. The power elites of this world think they have won by the death of Yeshua the Messiah, but yet God raised him up. And he has the last word on that. And so, again, we've talked about all the stories, is this Yeshua, is his resistance against the power base of the time. I can't emphasize that enough. This Yeshua's message is a message, it's a subversive message. It is the opposite of how the world functions. And so the stories that Yeshua tells, or the stories the things that he says within the stories that we read in the book of Matthew, jar us out of our present way of thinking, because there's always an element in there of Yeshua pushing back against the kingdoms of this world. And we need to be able to look at these narratives, for example, in the book of Matthew, to be able to see this story. So the emphasis, Matthew's emphasis, is on as a little bit of a synopsis here, is on a reflection of the Jewish Messiah. It's on a denunciation of the Pharisees, the ruling elites of the time. It's a defense against the Jews who were criticizing the Jewish Christians. We've got a lot going on here. It's an alternate vision for Israel based on the fulfillment of Yeshua, who was the hope of Israel. And again, the lens through which we are going to see Matthew and really all of the Gospels and into the entirety of the New Testament is what we would call Exodus language. It's this replay, the recapitulation, it is the retelling of the story of the Exodus. Only now he's using a different kind of imagery, because now we're seeing language of new creation, something new being raised up, a new kingdom being launched on this earth. The story of Yeshua, again, is the story of Israel. We cannot separate those two things. One place we see this evident is in the book of Isaiah. So many of you read Isaiah 40 through 56. We call those the servant chapters, and we argue over whether they're talking about Israel or they're talking about the Messiah. But the reality is, Yeshua is Israel. He is representing the nation of Israel in his life. And so he, as the servant son, this is kingship language, because every king in the ancient world whose heir would come to the throne was the son. Whether it was his natural son or another who was raised up, he would be his adopted son. And so the concept of the servant is a concept of kingship. And so all through Isaiah 40 through 56, we see this language of kingship being played out. Again, the book of Matthew, it's no accident that Yeshua died at Passover, because he perfectly fulfilled the Passover in the Exodus. And so as the children of Israel are delivered through the slavery of Pharaoh, under his grip, under his control, now the people are delivered from the same imagery of delivered from the sin of slavery. Sin is slavery. Sin, in essence, functions, if you will, it's kind of a metaphor for world domination or tyrants. What tyrants do to people is what sin does. It holds them captive. And of course, within the idea of sin are just being held captive to all these various addictions and things, slaves to that, not ever being able to get free. So there's a message in that. That is kind of the message, the subversive message or act of the kingdom of heaven, is to deliver from sin, from that kind of control, the same way that tyrants had control over people. So we are going to, as we get into the book of Matthew, we are going to examine it from the perspective of the Exodus. We need to keep in our minds, we are going to replay that story. We're going to see that story replayed, I should say, over and over again. And one of the things I want to put your attention on is that Yeshua is playing out the role of Moses as the main event. And we'll talk more of that, for instance, when we go into the story, when Yeshua goes out into the wilderness and is confronted with by the devil. This is all Exodus language replay, and Yeshua functioning in the role of Moses. When Yeshua goes up on the mountain in Acts chapter 1 into the cloud, that is a replay of Moses going up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, into the cloud. It is a picture of the high priest going into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when he brings in the shovelful, he lays the shovel down, and he has a shovel, a handful of incense that he puts on the hot burning coals, and that creates this smoke that rises up. The imagery here is of a cloud. And so in the way that the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies, is the way that Moses entered into the cloud on Mount Sinai, is the way that Yeshua entered into the cloud on the Mount of Olives. All of this is replaying the Exodus, the deliverance of the people from the tyrant of sin, if you will. And so kingship, again, is a very important theme in all this. And interestingly enough, too, if Moses is functioning in the role of king, he never actually took the throne, if you will. He never crossed over into the land and took the throne. Of course, at that time, they had the portable tabernacle. And the tabernacle in the holiest holy place was where the king would sit, where the throne was supposed to be. Now, at the time of Matthew, as we're moving forward and coming into the 2nd century, Judaism is no longer a rigidly fixed religion. Remember, the temple's been destroyed, and so things are in flux, and they got to figure out a way to keep this thing together. So the idea, it was a painful period, the separation from their network. And man, we can't imagine going into exile or being scattered to another place and leaving behind family. And so consider life for the Jewish believers as they move out into the Roman Empire. I mean, they've lost their temple, they have lost that which is familiar, they have lost their structure, and so now they're separated from their networks, their family networks, their religious networks, their social, and even commercial relationships. It's like just, you've lost everything, and now you have been totally uprooted, and you've got to go somewhere else and start over, and everything you have known is gone. And that's what it looked like in the 1st century. And within that environment, congregations of Jews and Christians kind of held together, and they were not separated or isolated from one another. But we do find that people did move in and out of the varying groups, out of Gentile groups, out of Jewish groups. There was a freedom to move around, even in that environment. Matthew was written in an environment where Jews and Jewish Christians and Gentile converts really did want to remain part of the Jewish communities themselves. So they were, in essence, isolated, but they wanted to stay together as a whole and bring unity with that in that environment, which it did for a while, but eventually that all fell apart. There was, within that type of a congregation, try to imagine a congregation like that. You got Jewish Christians, you got Gentile converts, and you've got the traditional Jewish community. And so, it was destined to blow apart, I think. And so the mounting pressure was to expel the Jewish Christians and expel the Gentile converts, which eventually did happen, and they, of course, formed their own, and we see Paul going around to those various synagogues in other parts of the empire. The situation became very acute later in the 70s of the 1st century and well into the 80s, and so they had a great need to hold together, even though they had lost everything. So I realize I'm really trying to get you to understand what the conditions were like on the ground in the 1st century, because we don't really ever think about that. We just see Yeshua wandering around Israel and walking and talking and sharing with people, and that's and then we kind of know, well, yeah, there's a temple standing there, and there's leaders, and he doesn't really particularly like them, and he tells them how awful they are. We are often so far removed from what life is actually like and the structure of things in the 1st century. And so the idea was to point the way at that time to a new world in which Yeshua is Israel's Messiah. That's key. And by following him, one was fulfilling Israel's heritage. Now, I'd like to, this will be the sort of last section before we actually get into the book of Matthew, to see how long it takes just to lay out the foundation, what life was like at the time. So this this, as we close out this particular session, we talk about the literacy levels at that time was very, very low, higher for Jews than for anyone else. And that's because the Jews in the first century, and typical Jews throughout history, have always put an emphasis on their sacred texts. Early Christians in the first century were basically functionally illiterate. So it was that the first followers of Yeshua would teach others to read. And this was a time in which, when education was basically just for the elites or the rich. But we do see some of the overflow in the Jewish community. You don't see it in the Christian community or the Gentile community at the time, because the synagogues were education centers. That's where you learned the sacred texts, and you learned how to read, and you were highly educated. And so Gentile Christians who were not early on in the synagogue would not have had that benefit. But as they came into the synagogue, that's an area in which they grew. So you already see through Messiah Yeshua and what he's done, he has enabled those who have been marginalized to grow. The story of the kingdom, the launching of the kingdom, is about raising people up and giving them dignity and humanity and equipping them with the tools to succeed and to flourish and to blossom where they're transplanted. And so this really is the message of the gospel, that you are not the same, you are not held down, you are not held captive, that God has raised you up and enabled you and given you opportunities that you would never have, a kind of freedom to grow in your own life and to grow in your family, etc. And so this is all part of the gospel message that we just sort of forget, because today we have the advantage. Anyone on the planet has the advantage through the internet or whatever to read and to grow and to get access to information. And that just was not the case in the first century. And so this equipping people who had previously not had any opportunities in these areas is just absolutely tremendous. So again, I want you to consider that the kingdom of heaven is always operating. It is always giving people a chance to grow and to flourish and prosper wherever they've been planted. And that has been true since time immemorial, since the beginning of history. So I want to thank you for joining me in this series, What Did Yeshua Mean?, as we go through the story and the Gospel of Matthew. I'll see you next time. Shalom.